You've probably heard it said that in the last days, there will be a final 7 years. But where does the idea of 7 years come from? I mean, did someone just make that up and it caught on? Or is there a biblical basis for thinking in terms of a timeline of 7 years? The only way for the seemingly mysterious prophecies of the Bible to make any sense at all is that we must recognize how the Bible goes about establishing the timing framework of 7 years, wherein many of these prophecies will be fulfilled. Hey everyone, I'm John Wertzma, and today we're going to be discussing the final 7 years. Why do we call it 7 years? Why is it 7 years? You know, the Bible talks about a lot of prophecies that are going to happen at the end of this present age. You know, Galatians 1:4 calls it this present evil age. That's because Satan is currently the god of this world, and until he is removed from that position of authority, this age is the present evil age. But at the end of the age, and we see kind of hints of this in some of the parables where, you know, the wheat and the tares parable where Jesus said, at the end of the age, right? So we have this language throughout the New Testament, and we generally look at the prophecies of the book of Revelation, I should say the majority of the prophecies of the book of Revelation, as happening within a 7-year period. But that brings us to the question of why do we think it's a 7-year period? And so on the road to explaining why it's 7 years, we're going to end up in Daniel chapter 9. But that's not the beginning of our journey to understanding what's going on. The beginning of our journey starts way prior to Daniel, all the way back to Moses and the Exodus. Now, we know the story. When Moses went to Pharaoh, he said, "Let my people go." After a series of plagues, they had the Passover meal, and then the next morning they set out to leave Egypt, and they found that they made their way to the Red Sea. They were trapped there. Then God parted the Red Sea. When they crossed over, they eventually made their way to Mount Sinai. And here at Mount Sinai is where the story of the 7 years at the time of the end actually begins. Now, I want to tell you a personal story. Last year, I was blessed and had the privilege of going to Saudi Arabia and actually climbing what I would call the real Mount Sinai. Now, there are differences of opinions as to where the real Mount Sinai is. The traditional site is over in the Sinai Peninsula. However, there's never been any archaeological findings that actually validate that location. It's based more on tradition than anything else. But there is a new location, a new site that has become very popular in recent years. And there has been some very adventurous tour guides that are leading people to go to this area and to see this area, explore it, and see the evidence that exists that this mountain here in northwest Saudi Arabia is the real Mount Sinai. And so I signed up to go on a tour and went and spent, 5 or 6 days over there. And one of the most exciting things I was able to do was actually got to climb this mountain. The locals call it Jabal al-Musa, the Mountain of Moses. And at the base of the mountain, there are some remnants of an ancient altar. Just adjacent to the mountain, there's like these huge, massive stones that are kind of built like an altar, and they've got pictures on them of calves and almost looks like they're having an orgy. And you've got all these different things happening. That would be the altar of the golden calf. You've got a cemetery not that far away from the mountain where it looks like thousands of people were buried. And look, this is out in the middle of nowhere. How would there be a cemetery with thousands of people? This all goes in with the biblical story, right? So there's a lot of evidence. To me, it's overwhelming evidence that this is the real Mount Sinai. And so I was able to climb the mountain and got to the top, and it's just a fantastic difficult but fantastic experience. But I have a new appreciation for Moses because he climbed up and down Mount Sinai 7 times. Now, I had a difficult time doing it just the one time. And, he's 80 years old. So Moses is, climbed up there his 3rd time. He comes back down, and God speaks to all of them audibly, and they get really scared and freaked out. They wanted Moses to tell him, just speak to Moses and then have Moses tell us what he said. Well, in Exodus, here is what God told Moses to tell the people. And this is the first instance on our road to understanding why there's going to be 7 years at the end of this age. And here's what that verse says. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. But there's more to this. After the 5th trip up the mountain, Moses got instruction to build the tabernacle. And then after, about 9 months or a year later, they built the tabernacle, and then God spoke to Moses in the tabernacle and gave them further instruction. And here's what he said. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you may sow in your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather the produce. But in the 7th year, the land must have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You must not sow your field or prune your vineyard. So in this verse, we have the added instruction that once you get to the promised land, once you get to the land I will show you, is talking about the promised land. So, we know that for the next 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness, and they weren't doing much farming back then. We know God had fed them with manna during the 40 years. But once they got to the promised land and they started farming the land, they were supposed to let the land rest for every 7 years. Now, there was an additional instruction that God gave them that if they didn't obey this command, there was going to be a very severe punishment. The punishment was this: I myself will make the land desolate, and your enemies who live in it will be appalled. I will scatter you among the nations and unsheath the sword after you, so your land will become desolate, and your cities will become a waste. The land will make up for its Sabbaths all the days it lies desolate while you are in the land of your enemies. Then the land will rest and make up its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation. It will have the rest it did not have on your Sabbaths when you lived in it. Leviticus 26, verse 32 to 35. Now, when they got to the promised land after 40 years in the wilderness, for 800 years, they lived in the land, but for 490 of those years, they didn't obey God, and they didn't let the land rest. They forgot about it, and they were like, look, we're going to plant. This is the 7th year, but we're going to plant anyway. And so they disobeyed God, and the punishment, again, was that they were going to be kicked out of the land. And that's exactly what happened to them. So when we look at the 490 years that they were disobeying God's command, they didn't disobey every single one of the 490 years. They disobeyed every 7th year for 490 years. So there was a total of 70 years that they disobeyed. And so this 70 years of disobedience was the basis for their 70 years of exile. Remember, God said that they were going to get expelled from the land if they disobeyed this command. And so the 70 years of disobedience became the basis for the 70 years of exile in Babylon. Now, in preparation for their exile from the land, God sent them the prophet Jeremiah. And here's what Jeremiah said to them. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and will make it desolate forever. Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. Now, here's where the story intersects with the prophet Daniel, because Daniel, as a young boy, he was taken captive in the first wave of captivity into Babylon. Now, when Daniel chapter 9 begins, he's an old man at this time, maybe 60 years have gone by of the 70 years of captivity. And here's what Daniel chapter 9, verse 2 says. I, Daniel, came to understand from the sacred books that the number of years for fulfilling the desolations of Jerusalem, which had come as the Lord's message to the prophet Jeremiah, were 70 in number. Daniel 9, verse 2. So Daniel begins to realize that, hey, we're getting close to the end of the 70 years here, and he begins to pray to God and ask God for forgiveness for him and for his people, and really seeks the Lord about what's next, what's the next chapter for the people of Israel. Where's this going? And God sends Gabriel to him, Gabriel the archangel, and gives him a message. And it's this message that we're going to talk about next, that this is where we get the idea of a 7-year period at the end of the age. Gabriel said to Daniel, 70 weeks have been determined concerning your people and your holy city, to put an end to rebellion, to bring sin to completion, to atone for iniquity, to bring in perpetual righteousness, to seal up the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. Daniel 9, verse 24. Now, here's where we have to do a little bit of explaining, because when Gabriel said 70 weeks have been determined, that's not talking about 70 weeks in the sense that we think of like a 7-day week. Okay, the Hebrew word for weeks is shavua, and it means a period of 7. So it could be a period of 7 days, or a period of 7 minutes, 7 months, 7 years, 7 decades. Okay, it's not specified in the text what this period of 7 is. It just says 70 periods of 7. Actually, like literally, it would be like 77s have been determined. So we have to lean on the context of the chapter to determine, well, is this talking about 70 periods of 7 days or 70 periods of 7 years? And so I'm going to show you in a little bit that the context implies that this is talking about 70 periods of 7 years, which is 490 years. So in other words, Gabriel is saying 490 years have been determined for your people and for your holy city. Now, that kind of goes back to make sense, because they were in the promised land for 800 years, but 490 of those years, they didn't let the land rest. Now, here's where the angel Gabriel begins to break down the 490 years into 3 sections. Gabriel says, "So know and understand, from the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed one, a prince, arrives, there will be a period of 7 weeks and 62 weeks." Okay, so what Gabriel is saying is he's breaking down the 70 periods of 7 into 3 categories. And in this verse we just read, he's just mentioned the first 2 categories, the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks, which are the first 2 of 3 categories. Now, let me just say that there's 62, there's 7, and then there's 1. And the total of all of them equals 70. And that's the number that where we're going to end up at the end of this chapter. But the reason Gabriel is breaking this down into 3 sections is because he's clarifying what's going to happen within each of these sections. The first section of 7 weeks, it will be the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And so the process of restoring and rebuilding Jerusalem will last for 7 weeks. or 7 periods of 7. So we know this is going to take more than 7 literal weeks to rebuild the city. So this is why we know it's talking about years, 7 periods of 7 years, or 49 years. And then once the city is built, the next section of 62 weeks or 62 periods begins. Now, 62 periods of 7 years is 434 years. So when you total up the first section of 49 years and the second section of 434 years, you have a total of 483 years. And he goes on to say that after the second section, an anointed one will be cut off. And that would be talking about when he was cut off from his people, he was rejected as the Messiah, and he was crucified. So the 69 periods of 7, or the total of 483 years, would expire at the end of Jesus' earthly ministry when he was actually cut off. Now there's one more week or one more period of 7 left to complete the total number of 70. And so in verse 27 of this chapter, we end up seeing where this last week or period of 7 years comes from. And so let's read the first part of verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week or 1 period of 7 years. But in the middle of that 7 years, he will bring sacrifices and offering to a halt. This is where we get the idea of a 7-year framework, because up until the time when Jesus was crucified, or when he was cut off from his people and rejected as the Messiah, 483 of the 490 years that Gabriel said would happen will have expired. Okay, so now the question is when does the last 7 years begin? Did it begin back in the first century after Jesus was crucified? No. It begins at the time when the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation comes about. And so this is where we get the idea that this 7 years is pushed way into the future to a final 7-year period of time at the end of the age.